So first I'm going to introduce our speaker here, and then I will turn it over to him. So thank you everybody for joining us in another talk, for another talk in our series, Conversations with the Past. Just again, a reminder before we get started to please ensure that you're muted for the duration of the talk, just so that we can hear our speaker nice and clearly. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to just type them into the chat and we can address those at the end.
And what's your name?
I'm Maureen Folk, and then I'm going to introduce our speaker in just a second. Tonight, we're thrilled to be joined by Scott Ferrara. Scott is a historical archaeologist specializing in colonialism in the Northeast United States. He is currently a PhD student at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and teaches courses at Queens College. He's also the collections and exhibits coordinator at Three Village Historical Society in Setauket, New York, on Long Island. So without any further delay, I'll pass it over to Scott for his talk about his debut novel, Accused of Witchcraft in New York.
Great. Thanks, Maureen. Let me just get this PowerPoint going. Let's see. All right. You can see this, the PowerPoint?
Yes, we're good.
Great. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Maureen and the Chapman Museum for inviting me to come talk with you all tonight. Maureen and I were actually classmates at Binghamton, and we were lab mates in the Paleoethnobotanical lab, where we both got our master's degree. So long time friends. So thanks, Maureen, for inviting me. My name is Scott Ferrara. And as Maureen said, I'm an archaeologist working on my PhD at the Graduate Center. My academic research focuses on colonialism, but specifically archaeobotany in the Northeast United States. So when you're looking at a lot of these historical texts and trying to understand how plants are used in the 1600s, you often come across tales of witchcraft and folklore that are being used here. So today we'll be discussing some of New York witchcraft history that I've been working on. And towards the end, I'll talk about some recent developments that have been going on with witchcraft history in New York since the book has come out. Let's see, there we go. So it's incredibly difficult to cram the life stories of over 24 New Yorkers accused of witchcraft into an hour lecture. So luckily, all the information I'm covering today can be found in my book, Accused of Witchcraft in New York, which was released in February by the History Press. It's an imprint of Arcadia Publishing and can be found by most booksellers. The book itself is a compendium of numerous individuals who were accused of witchcraft during this colonial period of New York history. Essentially, I was constructing this community of people who were all accused of witchcraft in New York during this time period, the 16 and 1700s. My intention for the book was to compile all of these accounts in one place so it could be used as a source for both regional witchcraft researchers and the public who want to know more about New York history. I've included historical maps, some original maps, location descriptions of many of the areas discussed. So you could actually travel to some of these locations if you choose to do so and walk the same paths and same areas where some of these really early communities once lived. I cast a wide net over the demographics of those accused of witchcraft. I searched for historical mentions of not only Euro-American accused witches, but also Native American accounts, as well as enslaved African people who were accused. The presentation of my book does not discuss present-day witchcraft movements and spirituality, which have all of which have reclaimed the term witchcraft in an effort to honor medieval European healers accused as witches. So I'm not really talking about modern-day witchcraft spiritualism, but rather this more historic definition of witchcraft, which I'll go into. The research for this was pretty intensive and time consuming. I mean, I was able to get a lot of information through digital archives during the COVID-19 lockdown. This collage here shows some of my sources for that historical research. For example, the Hattie Trust Digital Library, Google Books. These are great. I mean, there are so many original historic documents that are available just online that have been scanned and digitized from archives across the country. Ancestry, where is it? My Heritage, Family Search. These genealogical websites were invaluable as well. We have census records and some of the earliest settlers here were incredible at note taking and record keeping. So when it comes to families and tracking down people, where they lived and locations, these genealogical websites are incredible. I'm sure a lot of you who have done genealogical work on your own have already came to that conclusion. There's an abundance of information out there. State and local libraries as well, the New York Public Library, the Connecticut, I don't have the Connecticut Library logo on here, but they were great too. Brown University, all these have the original and sometimes transcribed original documents just available online. And as well as Town of Islip and Three Village Historical Society, where I was able to see some of these original documents in person. Okay. So all of this research led me to roughly 24 accounts, or about 30 individuals accused of witchcraft in the 17th and 18th century within what we would now identify as New York State. Some of them I found were more folklore than fact. You can see from my map here, the majority were clustered towards the coastal area. I'll explain that here in a bit. So there weren't too many happening in the Chapman Museum's neck of the woods, but mostly in the coastal region. So witchcraft itself, this belief in witches dates back to pre-Roman times, but the fear was especially deadly between the 14 and 1700s. During this period in European history, there were somewhere around 100,000 people accused of witchcraft in Europe, and about half of that executed for the crime. The belief in witches never completely dissipated and actually persists even to today. What did change here in the Northeast is this willingness of authorities and magistrates to prosecute people for witchcraft crimes, in which the only evidence was spectral, or rather based on testimonies of the inflicted, where there was no tangible proof that where no tangible proof really existed. Also, the politicization of witchcraft, as well as the relationship between colonies, also contributed to this extinction of witchcraft accusations within colonial court records. During the mid-1600s, we have these waves of English settlers coming from Europe and settling on the East Coast. Predominantly Puritan settlers came to New England to escape religious persecution back in England, but ultimately created a society where they were free to create this cultural structure that favored the Puritan way of life and persecuted all others. It is in New England that we see the highest frequency of witchcraft accusations. For New York, we had the Dutch West India Company that was coming from the Netherlands, this corporate entity. It was pursuing corporate ventures largely in Brazil and the Caribbean, and set up a corporate colony in New York City or New York, which was known as New Netherland, and ultimately was a failed corporate venture. It was short-lived, but during its time, we did have brushes with witchcraft. So when the Europeans did arrive, they found that tons and tons of communities had beat them here by a little bit more than 10,000 years. Algonquins like the Pequot, Mohegan, Nantucket, Shinnecock, Lenape, all within this coastal area. And of course, the Haudenosaunee, also sometimes also called the Iroquois, in greater New York. The indigenous witchcraft accounts that I found during this period, 1600s, related mostly to the changing political atmosphere that European settlers were constructing. So you see here how there weren't any recognizable states at the time, but rather these independent colonies, the Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, Connecticut Colony, New Haven Colony. They were all at one point or another all at odds with each other for different political reasons through time. Coastal New England Algonquin leaders picked up on these intercolony feuds and frequently employed new strategies of wresting control over their tribal enemies by weaving themselves into the constant feuding that occurred between the various European colonial authorities. It is here we see witchcraft accusations from native leaders against other enemy tribal leaders, largely in the east end of Long Island. So just for example, here on the east end of Long Island, for example, you had the Montauk and the Shinnecock, who allied themselves with a prominent settler of the Connecticut colony known as Lion Gardner. St. Uncas of the Mohegans was with the Connecticut colony on the mainland here. Sachem Myantonomi of the Narragansett with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Sachem Ninigret of the Niantic with Roger Williams over here in Providence Plantations, what would later become Rhode Island. So you'd have these alliances between certain tribal entities and their colonial neighbors, although good in theory, but ultimately all rooted in this system of exploitation. Okay, so when it comes to settling New York, the Dutch, some of the earliest settlers, were arriving by ship, predominantly from the UK and the Netherlands. The Dutch colony on New Netherland continually tried to attract settlers into their colony, however where they could. Meanwhile, settlers from New England, trying to find a space to call their own, came down to the east end of Long Island. The Dutch and English hashed out a border agreement in 1650 that pretty much stated that English could claim domination over what is now the east end of New York or Suffolk County, or east end of Long Island or Suffolk County, Long Island, and the Dutch would have authority over the rest of coastal New York and greater New York along the Hudson. Okay, so I think this is as good as a place as any to stop and discuss what exactly I'm talking about when I say witch or witchcraft. So I'm defining witchcraft here in a very historical way, not related to modern witchcraft spiritualism, but this embodiment of stress and trauma from misfortune or death assigned to an individual with suspected magical abilities that they are using to cause harm. So pretty much there are two types of witchcraft that we see being conjured when people are accusing their neighbors of witchcraft. This first type is maleficium. It's Latin for harmful sorcery. It is this negative spiritual force that a witch exerts to cause harm to a person's health or property. And then we have diabolical witchcraft, which is more concerned about where these powers are coming from. And when we say diabolical witchcraft, that is by a direct pact with the Christian devil. Now, there are some traits that are also common to witches in New England and in the Northeast during the 16 and 1700s. That is largely female. Males were usually accused in their connection to a female accused witch. So if you were a a husband of an accused witch, a son or a brother, this relationship could land you in hot water as well. Sometimes women predominantly who had antisocial behavior or were seen as outsiders were often targeted. People who were socially vulnerable, so say if you were a woman, or rather you were in a family that was well off, you had money more so than some of your neighbors, and your husband died, this male head of the household died, and you were left to fend for yourself as the wife. This social vulnerability, not having this head of the household in this really patriarchal society, would leave you very vulnerable and often the target of gossip and rumor and ultimately witchcraft in some cases. And of course, we have variations that differ from what we're used to back in Europe before settlers came to the United States. So what I mean by that is this isn't the cities of Europe that we're talking about. This is the wild frontier. There are different types of fear manifesting into witch accusations with different causes than seen in Europe. Witchcraft wasn't just in Salem in 1690s, right? It was throughout all of the colonies in North America, or throughout the entire Americas. By my estimate, there were over 400 accounts only alone in the 1600s. Only a small, what I found most interesting was only a small percentage of that were healers. So back in Europe, most of the people being accused of witchcraft were these community healers, these herbalists, these people who are potion makers. This is not the case in the New World. This is not the case especially here in New York and in New England. Some witchcraft scholars like Carol Carlson identified only about 6% of people accused of witchcraft, of these women, only about 22 of them, 6%, identified as a healer or a midwife. Other historians like John Putnam Demos only identified 2 who were specifically named as a midwife. That was Jane Hopkins of Boston and Hannah Jones of Portsmouth. So just, being a healer didn't mean that you were necessarily going to be accused of witchcraft. In fact, anyone, if you were just a woman in general, could lead you to an accusation and being at the heart of all this community gossip. So what exactly does this mean when you are accused? Well, for the most part, in order to be convicted of witchcraft, if you are accused, there has to be a clear connection that you had a direct pact with the Christian devil. So what that means is that in your testimony, or in the testimony against you, if you are being accused, that it had to be explicitly mentioned that you signed your name in the devil's book and signed your soul over to the devil to gain these witchy powers, right, of bewitching your neighbors. What happens once you do sign your soul over to become a witch? Well, you get access to a very exclusive club in your community called a coven, and a lot of the a lot of the testimony that was given against people accused of witchcraft often mentioned how they would see the accused witch at these parties at night, dancing and drinking wine and just having a good time. So these testimonies of signing your name to the devil and then being seen with among these covens gathering at night were often would lead to a conviction if you were accused. So there are four categories of testimony that other witchcraft historians have reduced all these different testimonies down to, the first being injury or murder by magic. So this is when there is some kind of homicidal intent that through the inappropriate use of, say, herbal or folk medicine, or even employing, if a witch employs their own apparition to attack a victim, causing that victim personal injury. Fortune telling is not only telling your future, right, using things like tarot cards, which actually date back to the 15th century, but this idea of fortune telling describes the act of receiving information from the devil about future events and employing or relaying that information to others. So early settlers generally accepted some forms of astrology that could aid in the cultivation and harvesting, but consider that fortune telling of future events generally as taboo or evil. So it's a little bit ambiguous with how fortune telling is used, or how at least legally. I should also say that one of the more explicit uses of fortune telling to try to convict someone was in Salem, New York, up by Glen Falls, closer to Glen Falls than I am here in Long Island, where a woman named Margaret Telford was accused, and fortune telling played a large role in that accusation. Shape-shifting is another common testimony against witches or accused witches. This is the ability to change and project one's spirit in the form of an apparition and cause mayhem. Spectral appearances is similar to the idea of this idea of astral projection, though in this context it was a talent that could be bestowed on an individual after making a pact with the devil. So pretty much you made the pact with the devil, and then you could project your spirit to go out into the world and cause harm on your enemies. Lastly was this term called harms, which was used in these early testimonies. This idea that really implied the attribution of unfamiliar medical symptoms, for example, stiff limbs or nosebleeds, that you were causing to a victim, or even daily common misfortunes, spoiled food or drink, weird animal behavior. If your cattle or your goats are acting strangely, you've never seen them do some wild things before, and they're acting up. Sometimes if your cream wouldn't turn into butter, or sometimes if there's one testimony where a empty barrel exploded as if it was pressurized, but there was nothing in it and it was open. So these weird incidents were attributed to being bewitched by a neighbor, and would often be used in testimony against a specific person. So here are when you signed your soul over to the devil, you not only got these powers, but you were also granted a personal imp, which could take the form of many different animals, as you see here. These imps were called familiars or familiar spirits. And in New York, we have plenty of testimony that mentions a lot of these different animals being attributed to people accused of witchcraft as their familiars: dogs, cats, foxes, rabbits, etc. Here are some historical woodcut illustrations depicting witches and the familiars. This is a famous witch hunter in England, Matthew Hopkins, who, along with all of these different familiar creatures, my favorite is Vinegar Tom, one of my favorite names of a familiar. So the familiar itself, people who claimed to be victims of bewitchment often describe being tormented not by the witch herself, but by their familiar who is doing their bidding. Often testimony would include that the familiar, or rather this imp-like creature, would visit them as they slept at night and lay down on their chests with a tremendous weight, and that the victim would be restrained by this. And while they were restrained, the familiar would torment them. As seen here in this famous painting called The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli in 1781. These experiences are eerily similar to common sleep paralysis, which many people still suffer from today. This being tormented at night, seeing things like this. Familiars wouldn't just torment their victims at night while they slept, but also cause harms. They would cause tragedy and misfortune to befall on the community. For example, very common folklore that surrounds familiars is barns collapsing or hay getting soaked before it can reach the barn when they're harvesting. Some common familiars that are discussed in New York history and folklore are dogs. We have white deers, specifically out on Long Island. We have ducks attributed with the Seneca folklore upstate, and of course cats, which are also commonly seen as witches' familiars, and even still attributed to witchcraft today. So how did people protect against this? Because there were very different types of protections that were socially acceptable during the colonial period. These types of white witchcraft that you could use to protect yourself and your home against bewitchment of your neighbors. So I've here a few different types of artifacts. I am an archaeologist, so I did locate several types of these protective artifacts that have been discovered among historic sites throughout New York. The first being mummified cats. So using cats as protective devices has a bit of an obscure history. We see cat burials archaeologically in many ancient cultures and tombs, likely as a sacrificial offering to deities, loved pets to accompany their owners in the afterlife, or some other religious purpose. What we do know is that these practices carry over into the modern era. In fact, some scholars have argued that the presence of these cat burials may be linked to a minor sacrifice of the home, whereas cats are killed to serve as a protective spirit to guard the house from spiritual attacks. The credibility of this argument is a little spotty, but interesting nonetheless. We do know that there was a decree by the Pope in the 13th century, specifically by Pope Gregory the Ninth, that condemned Luciferianism, or the perceived worship of the Christian devil, and that the killing of black cats could combat demonic evil. Some scholars suggest that this papal decree led to the widespread torture or killing of cats throughout Europe in the years before the spread of the Black Plague. The Black Plague was a pandemic that caused widespread sickness and death throughout Europe, and was believed to be caused by fleas transported by rats, and perhaps if there were more cats, there might have been a completely different history in Europe. So these cats were intentionally concealed within the homes of people who feared spiritual attacks, and they're seen throughout New York State and a lot of different historic properties. Leather shoes. Like most of these protective devices, we interpret them to have this magical protection from contextual clues and historical sources, but tracing them down to explanations of why these specific items. Well, it's hard to pinpoint where these stories come from, but we do know that in the 14th century, there was a holy man named John Shorn who trapped the devil in a leather boot. By trapping the devil in a leather boot, he developed all this folklore and legend surrounding him about this event, and the idea being that leather shoes have some innate magical ability to trap evil. So leather shoes would be intentionally concealed, just like cats, within the walls of a home, as this early home security device. There's John Shorn with the devil in a leather boot. So one of the more familiar apotropaic devices, or rather protective artifacts, is the horseshoe. The idea that a witch cannot pass underneath the horseshoe, that that all the negative energy gets trapped before it can enter the threshold of your home. Horseshoes are perhaps the most common and recognizable protective device. We actually still use them. You still see horseshoes over the thresholds of doors and windowsills and barns throughout New York State today. The use of horseshoes really, again, hard to pinpoint where these beliefs come from, but iron is the use of iron is also closely related to magical practice and protective devices. Horses themselves were also used as a protective device. The uses of horses actually dates back to pre-Germanic tribes, where horse sacrifices would be used as curses on enemies, or even protection from curses by their enemies. Horse skulls were concealed as well within the walls or the floor of a home, and actually people also believe that keeping a horse skull within the walls of, say, a church could help with acoustics in some way or the other. I'm not really sure the physics on that one, but it was a held belief. One example of this is in the Sternberg house that's in Schoharie, New York. There was a horse skull found under the attic floorboards, intentionally concealed. These witch bottles or Bellarmine jugs also were common. We see a lot of these back in England and Europe before colonization of the Americas. This practice actually traveled with English settlers. These bottles would be intentionally concealed within the walls, also buried along the property. They would contain things like bent pins, not so fun things like urine, fingernail clippings, and hair, all to protect the occupants of any witches trying to enter your home. Some places where these were found were in North Greenbush, New York, Colony, New York, and also some historic houses in the Mohawk Valley. Then we also have Bible pages. So this is a little bit more obvious. These Bible pages were also kept in concealed within the walls of a home, and the idea being that the word of God was intended to protect the inhabitants from evil. Poppets. Poppets were used as another protective device. The idea being that, similar to a voodoo doll, but as a protective device, not to cause harm to any innocent people. The idea being that you make a doll, this puppet, and then you imbue it, you wrap or attach something to the doll that was the victim of witchcraft, say a hair of someone who was a victim of witchcraft, and then you cause harm to the doll, put pins in it, and the belief was that when you cause harm to that doll, the witch that was causing harm was then inflicted. They felt it, and since they were feeling this pain, they would come around and try to find who was inflicting this pain, and this could root out any witches in your neighborhood. Lastly, these inscriptions on walls and beams of historic homes, called sometimes these are called hexafoils or daisy wheels, but there's many other symbols. They were used in Europe and the Middle East since ancient times as protection against evil. The hexafoil here can be generated by the use of a single tool, a divider or compass, and results from inscribing the radius of a circle from a point on that circle, and using the two resulting points of intersections as points from which to draw additional arcs. Repeated 6 times, 12 arcs are generated, forming 6 petals of a flower-like form enclosed in the original circle. The idea of inscribing these witch marks was that these complicated geometric designs would confuse a witch in their astral form when they're projecting their spirit and trying to enter your house. These symbols would ideally confuse them and even trap them, and would keep them occupied so that they wouldn't come and bewitch you. So here are some selected locations of apotropaic artifacts. This is largely downstate. This is in coastal New York. There are many more locations in New York and within greater New York where these protective items have been found, especially through the 19th century. I mean, this fear of witchcraft really persisted beyond the 1600s, and we're still using these protective devices today. We still see horseshoes hung up above people's thresholds of their doors. So just to show you a little bit behind the curtain, I found a lot of these locations from previous research, largely from Cynthia K. Riley Ogg. Her PhD dissertation is online, and she provides a list of historic homes where these protective items were both found and also identified by historians and archaeologists. I have that reference at the end of this presentation. But there's plenty of houses, for example, even upstate, the Smith House in New Paltz, New York, the Van Loon House in Athens, New York, and many more. It's not only about these items being found, but identified by historians and archaeologists who can recognize the context of what these items were used for. One specific location was the old house in Cutchogue. This is all the way out on the east end of Long Island, where these poppets, a witch jug, and a horseshoe were all found concealed within the walls of one of the oldest houses constructed on Long Island and possibly New York State. Why exactly are we talking about New England? I mean, with a lot of the history here, New England and Long Island are very closely aligned in their history. The history of witchcraft in New York lies within the shadow of witchcraft persecutions in the New England colonies. So that we are on the same page, that we're all on the same page here. When I say New England, I'm referring to Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, and also, if we're splitting hairs, Suffolk County out on Long Island, which was once dominated by the English. These colonies all relied on this English puritanical law to maintain law and order. For the most part, they codified the law of Moses from the Bible. The idea was to create this pious society that adhered as strictly as possible to the word of the Lord as written in the Bible. As such, the accusations of witchcraft in Puritan society was a serious criminal offense and most certainly meant death for the convicted. The Puritans justified this from drawing largely on these two Bible passages, that is Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and Leviticus 20:27, a man also or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them. This justified the legal criminal convictions of witches and witchcraft almost entirely among neighbors. So between 1638 and 1693, nearly 400 European American settlers were accused of witchcraft in New England colonies alone. That is not even considering the witchcraft accusations occurring in other English colonies like Virginia, Maryland, the Caribbean, and these numbers do not include Native Americans or enslaved Africans who were also accused and are executed for the crimes of witchcraft. There is still much more work to be done with this. In New England, during the 17th century, some of the more notable and clustered witch panics are taking place in Hartford, Connecticut, Springfield, Massachusetts, Boston, and of course Salem, Massachusetts. With New York State, for the sake of capitalizing on time here, focusing much of the conversation on the 17th century, this map produced by the National Park Service shows us this radiating influence of the Dutch in this region, sometimes referred to as the New World Dutch cultural hearth. I've added some animations to the map that show not only the instances of witchcraft occurring in New York, but that these culturally Dutch zones would later become New York, were safe havens for people accused of witchcraft in New England. So as you can see here, this really dark mustardy color is the strongest presence of Dutch, and as it radiates out, you get less and less Dutch influence. So the first instances of witchcraft we see are in the Mohawk Valley, some French Jesuit missionaries who are accused of witchcraft by Mohawk tribes and subsequently executed. Sachem Pogatatuk out on in Montauk, Cornelius Melian in Staten Island, Sachem Wyandanch, also on the east end of Long Island. Elizabeth Garlick in East Hampton, she is accused of witchcraft by her neighbors and ultimately acquitted of the crime. They were unable to connect her victims' testimonies specifically to this diabolical form of witchcraft or this specific connection with the devil, and she was ultimately acquitted. We have Mary Wright Andrews in Oyster Bay, who was not a witch, but in the 19th century, certain historians had embellished her biography, associating her with the crime of witchcraft. Judith Varleth Bayard and Goodwife Ayres were part of the Hartford, Connecticut witchcraft hysteria. They were able to escape from Connecticut, from Hartford, to New York and seek safe haven. Mary and Ralph Hall, they were out in Setauket, They were accused by their neighbors, ultimately acquitted, but with conditions that they had to leave Setauket and they had to check in with the court yearly. They left this more English occupied, Puritan occupied Long Island and first sought shelter on City Island in the Bronx, and then in Hempstead, Long Island, more Dutch cultural zones. Of course, this is where around the time New Netherland is becoming New York. Catherine Harrison in Wethersfield, Connecticut, is accused by her neighbors. She is able to escape and she seeks shelter in the Bronx, in this more Dutch cultural zone. Hannah Trevally is in Southampton. She is accused but ultimately acquitted. Goodwife Miller, also in Connecticut. She is able to escape to upstate New York here, in this more Dutch cultural zone. And then we get to the Salem witch trials, where Mary and Philip English are able to escape to and seek shelter in New York City, as well as Elizabeth Carey, again in New York City. Winifred King Benham and her daughter Winifred Benham Jr. They're in Wallingford, Connecticut, and they escape Puritan magistrates and seek shelter and safe haven in Staten Island. So where are we at today? I mean, that is to say that New York had its own abundance of witchcraft accusations and trials. In fact, New York is quite the witchy place. Not only were we a refuge for those escaping witch accusations, but we maintained a witchy legacy through time and into the present. For example, we have the Fox sisters in 1848, whose infamy as self-proclaimed mediums helped to influence the spiritualism movement and kickstarted an entire public-facing industry of American psychic mediums and a popularity of metaphysical philosophies. And of course, Raymond Buckland, another notable individual in New York history, who in the 1960s brought the neo-pagan religion of Wicca to the United States, of which there are close to 2 million people who identify as Wiccan today. In 1966, Buckland opened the first witchcraft history museum in the United States, even before Salem. His museum was formerly in Bayshore, out on Long Island, before moving out to Ohio, where it is still available to be visited today. Some recent discoveries from the archives. I am working at the Three Village Historical Society in Setauket, the home of a former home of accused witches Mary and Ralph Hall. We are currently working on identifying their homestead. We have tons of historical records and previous research of the 17th century in Setauket, and we're currently working with our interns, 2 high school students who are doing great work, trying to identify exactly where the Hall homestead was before they were banished from the community. Also, we have Elizabeth Garlick of East Hampton, and another accused witch who was originally from East Hampton. This is somewhere in this vicinity here is where her homestead was. There is mention in our colonial records in Setauket that the Garlicks may have moved to Setauket after they were accused in East Hampton, possibly to escape all of the rumor and gossip that persisted after their trial. So these are all the fun things we're doing down on Long Island currently with our archives. Here are some selected references that I drew on for this lecture. This first one, Silent Sentinels. This is a Cynthia K. Riley Oggs PhD dissertation, but also a book that she recently published, or recently, probably 10 years now, Silent Sentinels. Highly recommend for locating some of the specific locations where these artifacts of protective witchcraft have been identified. That's my lecture. Thank you, everyone, for joining and talking about witchcraft with me. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'll if you wouldn't mind, I'll have you stop sharing your screen, and then if folks have questions, feel free to throw it into the chat or to unmute yourselves and ask a question. I'll actually get us started because I have one. I found it really interesting that you said that the sleep paralysis explanation for feeling that heavy weight on your chest in the middle of the night and seeing, figures or something in your room. So obviously some of these accusations come with some modern explanations for why they would think that. But what about things like your cream not turning into butter when you're churning it? So who's coming up with these as foundations for why someone could be a witch, and why do some have explanations and others are a little more nutty?
Yeah, I think it really boils down to anything. I mean, just to accuse someone of witchcraft meant that as someone who was claiming to be the victim of witchcraft, you were searching for reasons to accuse a specific person. Often, it seems like the target, the person who is accused was always in the forefront of people's minds before they were accused. Maybe the center of rumor and gossip, and then when things start going wrong in this very organized and society where you are responsible for everything, where your responsibilities as a person, as a family, as a community are reliant on everyone's or rather everyone's survival is reliant on your responsibility. So when the tiniest things go wrong, people are used as scapegoats, and usually those people are already in the forefront of people's minds.
Interesting. So they would have already had someone in mind and then just nitpicked at the different things that would come up and say that could mean that they're a witch. Or
yeah, I mean, for example, you had Elizabeth Garlick from East Hampton, where rumors already started with her back when they were settlers in Lynn, Massachusetts, and then once they got to East Hampton to set up their settlement, and things were already in motion, things were being built and constructed, and people were getting a little bit more complacent again. That's when the rumors started back up and led to her ultimate conviction. But we see this again and again throughout the state.
Okay, interesting. There are a few in the chat, so I have one here. Was this just a Puritan thing, or were there other religious sects, for lack of a better word, that had a propensity for accusations of witchcraft?
Yeah, so it wasn't really a superstition. It was just what was believed to be a natural factor of the natural world, right? This witchcraft for people in the 17th century was real. It was something that could harm you. It's something that you had to look out for. Everyone really had this fear and belief, even within Dutch occupied zones. While they weren't really prosecuting people for witchcraft, they needed more evidence beyond spectral evidence to convict someone. They still feared it. We still see these protective magical items within historic Dutch homes in New York State.
All right, I have another one for you. Can you repeat the name of the woman who was accused of witchcraft in Salem, New York? And a follow-up, does your book have some of the pictures and illustrations that you used in your presentation?
Yeah, so a ton of pictures and illustrations in the book, and maps. Even maps I constructed to make it a little bit more obvious of where to go if you're going on a road trip to see where these accused witches once lived. And her name was Margaret Telford. She's also in the book. She was in Salem. Her gravestone's still there as well.
Oh, okay, cool. So another one, it says in Salem, land was often acquired by their accuser, motive being greed. Has anyone looked at that in some of the cases that you've cited here?
Um, so it's possible. I mean, not really with the a lot of the cases in New York were uh, people who are escaping witchcraft accusations elsewhere and coming to New York to seek shelter, to seeing New York as a safe haven, right? But in the accusations that did happen within New York, there are Catherine Harrison. People were trying to take advantage of her after her witchcraft accusations to gain her resources and wealth. But I mean, with some of the bigger names like Elizabeth Garlick out in East Hampton, no, she moved right back to uh, uh, where she her house was. There wasn't that specific motive. I think it was really uh, there were more motives than just trying to get land.
Yeah, so that could have been more case by case.
Yeah.
So one more kind of broad one is what brought you to this research?
Oh, well, I was always interested in spooky history. I feel like when uh, just talking with people about New York history, which I love to do, it can sometimes be a little bit boring for people. But when you say things like witchcraft and magic, it perks people's ears up, and then you can kind of talk more about the actual history of New York State, and all these larger processes that are happening here. Um, and it's spooky. I was always really into spooky things, so this is just really fun to research. There's a ton of archival documents and these primary source documents from witchcraft trials and accusations, that are actually a lot of fun to read, and accessible. Um, they're online. You can a lot of them from New England are in the Connecticut State Library and Brown University Library. They're available online. You can go check those out and read the transcripts and see the actual documents. Um, yeah.
Very nice. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? You can throw them in the chat or just unmute. Lots of thank yous in the chat if you haven't seen that. Excellent presentation. Donna, did you have a question that you wanted to put in the chat, or okay? How did they determine that a man was a witch?
Yeah. So men were also accused, but really only if they had a relationship with a female witch. So if they were a husband, a brother, a son, of a woman that was accused of witchcraft, then they were susceptible to being accused. Uh, as is the case with Ralph and Mary Hall. It was really Mary Hall who was the suspected witch, and Ralph was guilty by association.
Hmm. So it's really uncommon or even non-existent to find a man who's directly accused of witchcraft without being associated with a woman.
In European American settlers, that culture, yeah, but with Native Americans, it's a little bit different.
Hmm. Interesting. Donna did say in the chat that there was a preacher in Salem that was hung for because they were determined he was a witch. Interesting.
Yeah, the Giles Corey or I don't think
So it's rare.
yeah. um and Salem is its own beast. There were over 200 people accused during the Salem witch trials. And that was anything goes. That was a very isolated event. That was different motivations than throughout the colonies.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, so this is a fun one. Maybe we'll end on this. How many of us might have been accused of witchcraft if those standards were applied today?
Yeah, probably all of us. For not adhering to very strict puritanical laws. Yeah.
I mean, I can't speak for anyone else, but I'm not so sure that my butter churning skills would be good enough
Yeah.
For me to avoid that.
Me neither.
All right. With that said, I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and thank our speaker here, Scott, very much for sharing your book with us.
Thank you all.